So we're in a series called In Their Shoes. And we're talking about this idea of, I guess, Christ followers, to model the life of Christ. And John says that the Word became flesh. He became part of us and dwelled with us. And then Hebrews talks about, he did that so that he could be like this merciful and faithful high priest. There's this part of Christ that just, I want to be like you all. I want to understand what you go through so that we can go to him with anything in our lives. I think as Christ followers, that should be our responsibility as well. So we've been talking this month about what it looks like to try to see someone else's perspective. And so we're here because I want your perspective. And I mean this, I'm thankful for all of you all. All three of you all have spent time loving on our staff, talking to our staff, helping us to have a different perspective. It's my friend Terrence. I met Terrence a little over a year ago, maybe right at a year ago. Terrence is a pastor at Southeast Christian in Louisville. Kind of following our series here at Grace, he reached out to me, and we've been just kind of hanging out ever since then. Terrence's been somebody that's added perspective in my life. My buddy Donovan here, Donovan's an executive at Hunt Brothers Pizza, and Donovan reached out to me. We'd met a few times. Donovan reached out to me in the last year. I've been a part of a group of pastors that we just get online, doing Zoom calls, pastors from all over the U.S., and just having conversations about race and what we need to be doing as a church and what the role of the church is. And so thankful for your friendship. And Alonzo's been here in Georgetown for 30 years, but we just recently connected. Right. And Alonzo's doing some great stuff in our community. And so I wanted to hear about how we could be a part of that. We've interacted a little bit, and he also came and spent some time with our staff and added some perspective to us that we needed to have. And so I want to hear from you all. All of you all have spoken to my life. And I guess the first thing, we're talking about being in other people's shoes. All I know is white. My world's been pretty white most of my life. Went to all white schools. I've never had a teacher that wasn't white. I've never had a boss that wasn't white. I've never had neighbors that weren't white. Then I adopted a son from Uganda, and I thought, hey, I probably better start figuring this stuff out. But what I realized quickly is that there's just a lot of the world that I don't understand because of my little limited perspective. And so I'm working, I'm reading, I want to understand more. I know there's a lot of people in our church that feel the same way. And so what we're looking for is perspective from you all. And so curious, because all I know is white. Growing up in a different context, when's the first time that you were aware of your race? First time you realized maybe being black was different, and just your first exposure. Whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
I can remember so I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, all black community actually. And my father at one point said, you know what, I wanted, interesting, he was a visionary. And he said, I wanted more for my kids. So he packed us up and we moved to an all white community. So you kind of picture the tracks, right? We're on the other side of the tracks now. And it's so interesting. I can remember being there in second grade, third grade. Everybody in the neighborhood had motorcycles. So he didn't want me to feel any different. So he bought me a motorcycle, and we had dirt bikes, and we would ride through the neighborhood, and dirt bikes are really, really loud. And I remember a policeman pulling us over, all three of us. And of course, the black guy when he took the helmet off, he had me on the ground. And I can remember my mother coming out the door and talking to him. And I think that was the very first time, because I really didn't even see myself different, right? My parents tried to make us so insulated from racism that we didn't know a difference, good, bad, or indifferent, right? But when you asked that question, I think that was the first time I was like, wait, something's wrong here. Why do they get to go away and I'm on the ground? So,
yeah. Growing up, I don't know, I always knew that I was black and other people were white or other people might be Hispanic, but I grew up in a construct that just said but black people only get to about here, and Hispanic people only get to about here, and everything else is just white. And so I'll tell two stories that kind of illuminated for me why that was problematic. I went off to college, and then I came home for the first time. And having lived in a new place for months, and relearning a new city, I noticed about that city that all the black people lived on one side of the railroad tracks, kind of what you're saying. And I was like, man, this is crazy. Like, everybody lives on this side of the tracks. And that's the bad part of town that you're not supposed to go to. And so after being in college for 4 months, I come home and I'm pulling into my town and I'm starting to feel the exact same way I feel back in my college town. And I kind of come through town and I venture to the left under the underpass on MLK. And I'm like, wait a minute. I grew up my whole life on the left side of the tracks. And the school is on the right side. The public library is on the right side. The grocery store is on the right side. McDonald's, like every place you wanted to go was on. The good Halloween candy was on the right side of the tracks, right? And I never realized that my town that I love, that when you grow up, you want to be a Blue Devil, you want to play in the Granite Bowl, like that was kind of the dream. I never realized that my town was split by these tracks, and it broke me a little bit. It started making me resent where I was from, because I felt like they gave me a false security in where I was from. And then another story where I realized that for the first time, that my race can be really problematic to other people was, when I was in college. I finally got my first car, and the only car that we can afford was a Caprice, right? And a Caprice was like $600. So I got me this red 91 Caprice, and I loved my car. It's finally my car. But I noticed that I oftentimes fit the description of whoever the police was always looking for. And so time and time again, I would get pulled over in this car, really for no reason. In fact, there was this one officer who pulled me over 4 times in the span of like 3 weeks. The same as that officer, almost in the same as that spot every time. The 4th time he got to my window, I rolled down my window and he realized it was me. And he immediately said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry."
One really overt issue was when I was probably 16 years old and I was playing basketball, and we had just finished the game and really just beat down the other team pretty badly. And we were in the locker room just celebrating and jumping around. And I remember the door opening, and I remember seeing a very old white man standing in the doorway. I can still see his gray hair, his weathered face, his brown suit, his badge, and the gun. And he pointed the gun at me and said, "I know you did it. Come over here to this corner." And he was shaking really badly. And I was taught, just obey the law. Don't argue, because if you argue, it's going to end up bad. So I moved over to the corner and was trying to ask questions. "What do you mean? What's going on?" And the other person of color on the team, he pointed the gun at him and said, "I need you over here with him." So we're standing there, and this very elderly law enforcement individual standing there telling us, "Just tell me which one did it." And we had no knowledge. We had just got finished playing the game. And we're standing there, and then the coach comes in, and he's pretty livid because he sees the situation. He's trying to, take control. And finally, the law enforcement officer said, "One of the referees was hit in the back of the head with a piece of wood, and I know one of these 2 guys did it." And finally, one of my teammates raised his hand and said, "Hey, as we were coming down the hallway, I was beating on the doors." He says, "And I know one of the doors broke." He said, "I guess a piece of wood must have flown off and, at that point." But to be singled out of a crowd and to be accused of something that, why the 2 of us was in the back of my head. Not at that time. I was just trying not to get shot. But that was a very overt situation that has stayed with me for a long time.
I know most of you all of y'all really work in primarily white spaces. With your career, I know you're retired. You get to do what you want to do now.
Good
but
for me.
What's that been like? That's a unique experience that I'll probably never have. What's that like, primarily working around white people?
Yeah, for me, it's been a complex journey. So my first job out of college was actually terrible job. It was a door-to-door sales job for AT&T. And that job was pretty traumatic for me in my experiences, because I got hired by this company with high hopes, and but we would come in, we would get our leads. They send you out into these different communities, and you're just walking around in these communities, and the people don't know you're coming. They've never seen you before. And I would say time and time again, I would run into problems as a black male that I would go back and explain to my boss that he didn't have a concept for, because he would send one of my coworkers to the neighborhood the next day and they would come back with 4 sales. I'm like, I went to this neighborhood, people wouldn't open the door for me. I was sent to one place, and this was the date I decided to quit. I was sent to one place, and I get to one house, I knock on the door, I hear somebody in the house, they're not coming to the door, so I leave. It's a long driveway. I get to the end of the driveway, guy opens the door, hey, can I help you? I'm like, yeah, and I walk back up and got my AT&T gear on. I get to the door, he has a gun, and he's like, what do you want? And I'm like, man, I'm with AT&T, but I was leaving, like, and you called me back, you know, like, but we're fine, man. I'll be on my way. It's like, all right, get out of here. So I leave. I go sit in my car. I'm crying. I call my wife because I'm like 3 hours away from home. I'm like, honey, a guy just came to the door with a gun. Like, I was already leery about being out here. So she's like, oh, it's okay. Just, you know, she's giving me like the encouragement. I get out the car. I go to the very next house, and this lady sitting on the porch, and she's just like, oh, we're not used to seeing your kind out here. What are you doing? And I was like, well, you know, I'm trained in sales. So I smiled and I'm like, well, ma'am, you know, I'm out here at AT&T, blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, I would hate for you to end up in some type of altercation. So I think you better leave. And that was the day I said, okay, I'm done. And I packed up and I drove back home. And then explaining that to my boss, he still didn't have a concept. So working in a predominantly white space, I didn't have the support I felt like I needed.
It's good,
and
man.
So it's been a complex mixed bag for me.
The first thing comes to my mind is feels like you're in a foreign land. Everywhere you go, you're in a foreign land. Even though you are American, born and bred here, but you're still operating in a foreign land. Everything that I do, I have to watch what I say. I have to watch how I act. I have to watch. There's just a lot of stereotypes out there that our culture has created, and operating in a foreign land, you have the weight of your shoulder, the whole black community on your shoulder. That's what it feels like when you go to work.
You know, a lot of times you're the only person of color in the room. And to what Donovan's saying, how you respond to a question, you may be labeled as aggressive right off the bat. And then you have to be aware of that in the back of your head. So you're constantly thinking about, well, how am I going to ask this question, or how am I going to comment so I'm not perceived as being aggressive? I want to contribute, but I don't want people thinking, well, there he goes again. So it's tough, and you can't just sit there and not say anything, because then you get labeled for that. So it's just a constant battle that's churning over and over and over. You have to be a representative for those that are going to come in the future. And that's tough. All my working career, I felt like I've been in that position. And if I don't do a good job, it's going to affect people coming up years later. So I have to be cognizant of it 24/7.
Let's talk a little bit about this past year. May 25th, George Floyd is killed, and I don't know why that was the incident. Maybe it was because it was such in plain sight, but started conversations, protest. Everybody lands different places on it, but I'm just curious how you all process this past year. Maybe what that day was like, but what it's been like since then.
For me, personally, this is all I know. So it wasn't a surprise. But the difference is the new generation. My daughter, it really, really broke her. And I started thinking about that because it's interesting. We're close to the same ages. This is all we know. So I've almost come to accept it. Just another black man killed. No big deal. We've been seeing it all our lives. But to have that conversation where she wanted to protest and she wanted to march and she wanted to be able to have those conversations, because this was very, very raw to her.
Wow. Yeah, I relate. I relate completely. I think even when the incident happened, I never watched the video because I said my brain can't take seeing another video. So all throughout, all the incidents that happened, from the one here, from the one in Atlanta, all different, I never watched the videos anymore because I just can't take watching that and the trauma that it induces on my brain because of the role that I'm in as a pastor. Like people immediately, when everything happened, wanted to hear my voice. They wanted to know where I stood. They wanted advice. And so I had coworkers calling me, hey man, can I get a Zoom? Can I get a conversation? Members reaching out because they knew I was on staff. Hey, can we talk? So my wife, the day after that happened, it was probably 3 weeks in a row where I spent at least 4 hours a day talking to people about race, to where my wife took my phone and said, you're not having another conversation. You're not having another conversation with, nobody's even asked you, are you doing okay? They just want to know what they can do. And I was dying in every conversation, realizing how far we were because the conversations were starting in so many different places. Some conversations start where, man, I didn't know racism existed. And I'm like, I don't even know how we're starting here. Again, it was one of those moments where I said a number of times, man, my wife would be up at midnight. She'd be crying. I'm crying. Like, this stuff would never change. Why are we still here? Let's pack up and just go back to Georgia. And let's just find the blackest church we can find. And let's find like the blackest community and just immerse ourselves there and just never come out our hole again. And, it felt like a good plan and right, but then you wake up the next morning, you realize God's called you to something. And so what does your perseverance look like? And so I would say I'm still going through last year because I still don't feel like I've totally kind of got my mental state together.
It's been really tough. And with the George Floyd incident, I think because that was on social media and because so many people that watched that, I think they really felt it. They saw that 8 minutes. They lived through that 8 minutes. And I think some of them had, the sympathy, the empathy, the apathy. It was all there to feel. Those emotions were just out there. And I think that a lot of people actually started to step back and say, then this isn't right. And then when the Black Lives Matter movement started to happen and a lot of white people joined in on that, that was a really beautiful thing to see. But then I had people come to me and said, I don't get this Black Lives Matter thing. Why are people carrying signs that says Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter? I said, yes, but Black Lives Matter too. Back during the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of black men carried signs that says, I am a man. Because they were devalued to the point that from the white race, they were devalued, that it was not making them feel like a man. So they carried signs to let people know, I am a man. That's the same thing with Black Lives Matter and carrying those signs. Black Lives Matter too.
So I'll just address it to me so you don't feel like you're pointing anybody else out besides me. Well, like as a black man, what do I not understand? What do you wish somebody like me understood as a white person? Because I know my perspective is very limited. So help me.
It's just an earth suit. It's just an earth suit. If you really think about it, we had while I was in the Air Force, we had the opportunity to go visit NASA a couple times, and there it's interesting. They all have the same suit, the helmet, the same suit when they go into space. And I just started thinking about that correlation is that God has made us through salvation. He's redeemed us. And we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And what you're seeing here on earth is just my earth suit. I'm just like you. I think that's what I want to share. It's
Good
just
job.
an earth suit.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I go two ways. I say the first way would be just that it's okay to be honest about America. Like, that doesn't mean you love America less when you're honest about America. I think one of the things we're taught in school is that America good, Russia bad. China bad, North Korea bad, and we gloss over our genocide era. You know, I think sometimes white America takes criticism of America very personal. And it's not a critique of you, it's a critique of a false ideology that we allow to live. I think they should know that, like, black and brown people love America just as much as you do, but we wish that we could love it like you do. If that makes sense. Like, I long to love America in the way that some of my white friends long to love America, like the way they love America. Like, I can't understand it, because when I open up my history books, when I think about my family, when my dad tells me the story of walking to school, having to go to his own school because he couldn't ride the bus, and then the bus driving by and they're getting hit by rocks because all the white kids can ride the bus. Like, that's a part of my family history. Like, I can't love America like you do, but I love America. And I love America so much that I'm willing to push it to change.
One of the biggest challenges I think we start talking about where we came from, because I don't think we can understand why we are where we are if we don't talk about where we came from. So you'd either hear from people, why are we bringing up the past? Or, I don't like anything that makes America look bad. And so we have that struggle. And I love these. I mean, I can love America, but I can't love it the way you do. I want to, but you're aware of where we've been. And so I just want to say, like, all the feelings of defensiveness, I felt every one of those when you really have to be honest and think about who we are as a nation. And it's not fun, because that picture we got as a kid or in school, that we're this great nation, we're the new Israel, we're God's chosen people. That's a lot better picture than the reality of where we came from. So, yeah, I felt all that. What about you, Alonzo?
For white America, you're not blamed for slavery. Because a lot of people say, well, I wasn't around when slavery, and still blame it. No, that's not the case. We're talking about here and now. And the answers are in the Bible. Every answer that we have, every problem that we have, the answer is in Scripture.
Yeah.
And we would find that racism is not God's plan. Period. So if we know that, then what are we doing to combat racism? Racism's not a black problem. It's not a white problem. It's a people problem. And we need to sit down together to study the scriptures and find the answers. Let God lead us through it.
And I think what God is calling people to, if we just want to talk about Christians, he's just calling you to a Christian responsibility. Right? It's just a Christian responsibility. Like Jesus was a man that walked in the margins and gave every person he encountered value, even when the system said they're not valuable. He met the woman at the well and asked her for a drink. Yeah, he broke all the custom laws when it comes to racial tension, gender stuff, but he also put himself in service to her immediately. First time he ever met her, I need something from you. He immediately humbled himself to be served by her, gave her the upper hand, right? When Jesus interacted with the lepers, I'm going to touch you, right? And I think we could all learn something from that, but I think ultimately what sometimes happens is, because we haven't been discipling our churches and our people well, we unleash people from the place of power. So oftentimes when you hear sermons preached on racial reconciliation from a predominantly white church, it's almost, if you close your eyes, it almost sound like they're saying white people good, black people bad, but white people go over there and touch the black people, right? The white congregation is always the disciples going out to hang out with the Samaritans. They're never the Romans, right? They're never the people who came to faith that didn't have a Jewish heritage and said, I'm going back home to change something. We have to remind our white brothers and sisters that we're all grafted in. Like, we don't own this tree. We're all grafted in under the grace of God. You're grafted in. That dividing wall that existed when you would go to, it would have existed for you too.
So as we're wrapping up our time, what do we need to be doing? People are watching, so we're sitting here and our hearts break and we say, man, I'm man, I want to do something. I want to bring God's kingdom here. I think that's been one of the biggest challenges is we get this awareness. I think the stuff that happened last year, maybe even some stuff we've been talking about here at Grace, there's new awareness, but now what? What's some practical advice for the people that are in our church saying, we want to be a part of it, so what can we do?
Get to know people under their earth suit. It's going to be uncomfortable because we like to be around people who look like us, walk like us, talk like us. But make a conscious effort to get to know people under their earth suit. I think it's so important. Allies and advocates. I think about all the allies and advocates I've had in my career. Without them, I would be nowhere. I remember being in the Air Force, and I walked into the Air Force Ball for the first time as a leader. And when I walked in, there was no one in there. I was the only African American of about 400 or 500 people. And I remember walking in, and I was like, whoa, wow, there's a lot of people here. So I'm standing there at the door, and folks saw me, but they just kind of turned around and they just kept on talking. And I remember a gentleman, he was my commander, Lieutenant Colonel, came, grabbed me, Donovan, come sit at my table. And when we walked together down the aisle, and I sat at the table with him, and he introduced me to everybody at the table, he automatically gave me permission that I was okay. We need advocates, not just allies. Allies are the folks who walk with us, who hurt with us, but we need advocates as well, who can vouch for us. And I would say, be an advocate for someone.
That's good. Yeah, just piggybacking off you, a couple things came to mind. I would say first, I want to acknowledge that there are some people who struggle in this conversation because maybe they've had like a tough encounter racially, right? I had one friend who grew up in a very insulated white town, went off to college, and she was robbed, and the person that robbed her happened to be a black guy. That was kind of like one of her first interactions with black people, and all she had seen what was on TV. And so really it affirmed in her everything that she had grown up seeing in movies and things. And so she had a really hard time letting her guard down even to become my friend. And I just had to challenge her and say, like, how would you feel? How would you feel if I judged you based off the fact that my great-great-great-great-grandparents had slave owners? Like, how would that make you feel? Well, that wouldn't be fair. I'm me. And she gave her own answer. That conversation immediately paused, right? And it was a realization, like I've lived my whole life letting this one person's bad decisions define for me a whole community, right? And so I would say, make sure that the standard that you're giving to other people, you can live up to yourself, right? Make sure you're not judging on the standard that you won't allow yourself to be judged on. The second thing goes to the fact that we are communal in everything. And so number one, as an American, be a good American. What does it mean to be a good American? It means to look out for the well-being of your neighbor, right? That's what it means to be a good American. Like it is a good American to want equal rights for everybody. That's what a good American is. And so if you're proud to be an American, if you love America, then like bring America glory by the way that you live and love your neighbor well. Now, the bigger story for the Christian is understand that your faith is not individualized, but you say yes to a family. We because our evangelism explosion and our tent revivals that did some good for the church, I think ultimately it hurt us in that it individualized the faith so bad, where we only think about our own personal salvation. And our worldview doesn't extend beyond our family unit. And so our faith doesn't extend beyond our family unit. So I can love my cousin over here better because I have Jesus, but that's about far as I can go. And we have to do the challenging work of understanding, man, we are a part of a global community, a global community. You know, I chuckle in frustration, but every time like the Coptic church or the Nigerian church is persecuted, it's lit up on Facebook. Pray for the church, pray for the church, pray for the church. Is that the only time that we can acknowledge our communal nature? Is when we see brothers and sisters across the world being killed for their faith, or when we go over there to build a house? Like, or can we live in that reality here today? And if we would choose to do that here today, then a lot of these conversations would be easier. Like, this is a family. We got too many people wanting to be raptured out of here if they believe that theology and don't want to just deal with the here and now. They're just waiting on the rapture. Oh, the world is crazy. Jesus must be coming back. I'm just ready for him to take. I'm just ready for the rapture. And I'm sitting there in those conversations like, do you think that like in the 1920s and 30s, like black folks are walking around like this gotta be the time, Jesus. Like you gotta be coming back. Or let's go back through the Great Depression and all the world wars. Like there were Christians all over the place saying like this has to be the time. Or let's go back to the original writers of the scriptures who were looking up and saying any day now, Jesus. And so for you to Americanize your faith that a bad stock market and a bad housing market and the coronavirus here signals to you that the end is near and you're ready to be out of here has told me a lot about how you view yourself in the historic Christian church. The second thing is when we read that scripture, it forces us to think about what are people going through right now? Like, what are people having to persevere right now? In fact, what are my brothers and sisters in Christ having to persevere now? So even if you as a white person is not having to go through racial tension, your brothers and sisters in Christ are. And so therefore you need to be a part of their perseverance too, because that is something that they're facing. But you only get there when you embrace a communal perspective. We can't wait for it to look right in our pews because that's going to take time. That's generational work. All right. But we have to leave from our pews and go out and seek where the kingdom of God may be good news and take it there.
I love that. And I appreciate you all because all of you have done that for me. My friends, people I've been able to sit down and learn from and listen to and ask my dumb questions to at times trying to figure this out. But I appreciate you sharing with our church because we need more perspective. Like it's so easy for our world to get really small. And if you don't listen, then you don't know. And then I think we have to decide what we're going to do with the information we have. You know, I know it was referenced at some point, the Good Samaritan, they saw the pain, they just want to get near it. So they just kept going. But I think that's that proximity. Like we've seen it, it's here. Question is what we're going to do about it. What's our obligation as followers of Christ? And so thank you all for sharing.